Have you ever felt like your plans were totally set and then suddenly God steps in and wrecks everything? Maybe you had a really clear vision of the future, a career path or a relationships going a certain way, a dream. And then God asks you to take a different plan. And it feels like your plans are falling apart and God's plans are wrecking yours. That's exactly what happened to Jonah. He had his own plans, but God called him to something different, something uncomfortable. And instead of obeying, Jonah ran. And that's where Jonah's problems began. Today, we're going to look at Jonah's story. For the next few weeks, we'll be studying the book of Jonah. And what we're going to see is that running from God's plans always leads us into chaos. And surrendering to God's plans lead us to a place of peace. What we see in Jonah's story, and this happens for us too, is oftentimes God's plans disrupt our plans. This is what we read in Jonah chapter 1. I want you to see how it plays out for Jonah. Now, the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, "Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it. For their evil has come up before me." But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare and went down into it to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord. You see, Jonah had a plan, but God interrupted it. God called Jonah to go to Nineveh, a place that was known for wickedness and violence. Nineveh was actually the last place that Jonah would want to go. Imagine this. Imagine God was calling you to go somewhere. What would be the place you would want to go the least? That's what Nineveh was to Jonah. So instead of obeying, he runs in the opposite direction. Instead of traveling the roughly 550 miles to Nineveh, which is where Iraq is today, he travels about 45 miles in the opposite direction to the town of Joppa, but that's not far enough. That's not good enough. He wants nothing to do with what God's asking him to do. So he gets on a ship and travels another 2,500 miles in the opposite direction, away from Nineveh to Tarshish, which is in modern day Spain. And so I've got a picture for that, give you a picture of exactly what we're talking about here. Jonah is heading as far as he possibly can from where God wants him to be. And before we get all judgy with Jonah, isn't this what we often do with God's plans when they don't line up with ours? Maybe God's calling you to step out of your comfort zone, to forgive someone who's done you wrong, or to end an unhealthy relationship, or to change a career path. And what happens so often is, instead of trusting God's plan, we do what Jonah did, we run. We run because God's plan feels like they're wrecking our plans, and they feel like they're wrecking our comfortable lives that we've created for ourselves. And here's the thing. If you want to run from God, the devil will always offer you a ride. Sure enough, Jonah finds a ship that's headed to Tarshish, far away from where God wanted him to be. The fact of the matter is this: you could always find a boat that's sailing in the wrong direction. When we want to disobey God, there will always be a convenient way to avoid his calling. But those ways are never what they appear to be. They often lead us into a place of trouble. So why exactly did Jonah run. It boils down to the fact that he hated the people of Nineveh. To give you a little context as to why he would feel so much animosity towards them, Jonah's hatred for the Ninevites stemmed from their reputation as brutal and violent people. Nineveh was the capital of Assyria. It was an empire that was known for its ruthless military campaigns and its oppressive treatment of the conquered nations. And that would have included Jonah's own nation, Israel. The Assyrians often used terror and even torture as a tactic, instilling through acts of extreme cruelty. And Jonah, as an Israelite, likely felt deep resentment and fear towards the Ninevites who had harmed and threatened his people. Maybe he even had family members who were killed by the Ninevites. And so his reluctance to preach was deeply personal to him. He struggled with the idea that such a wicked, undeserving people could deserve God's mercy and forgiveness. You see, that's the real reason that Jonah didn't obey. Not because he's afraid of what's going to happen to him, but rather he knows the character of God, and he didn't want God to forgive his enemies. Let's be honest. It's easy to rationalize our disobedience. Jonah didn't just run from God, he rationalized it in his mind. Jonah thought Nineveh didn't deserve God's message and definitely not God's forgiveness. Maybe he figured God could get someone else to do it. I'm just not the guy. And no doubt in his mind, he made excuses to justify his disobedience. And let's be real, we do the same thing in our lives. We rationalize our sin. We think, well, I'll follow God later. Right now, I'm just going to do things my way. Or maybe this, God wouldn't ask me to do something that makes me uncomfortable. You see, we think things like this small little disobedience won't matter in the big picture. But the truth is, rationalizing sin leads to heartache. Jonah's story shows us that disobedience doesn't just affect us, it affects everybody around us. And the sad truth is that running from God will always bring you down. It's right here in our text. We see as Jonah's running from God in verse 3 that Jonah went down to Joppa. A few verses later, it says Jonah went down into the bottom of the ship. The next chapter, we'll see in chapter 2, verse 3, that Jonah went down into the depths of the sea. Listen to me. Running from God will always put your life on a downward trajectory. We think we're escaping, but in reality, we're sinking. Our lives get messier, our peace fades, and we end up in situations where we feel trapped. And what happens invariably is disobedience to God always causes chaos, not only for us, but for the people around us. We see it in verse 4. Then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea. Such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up. You see, because Jonah ran from God, because of his disobedience, a storm hit. And I want you to notice this storm didn't just affect Jonah. It endangered everybody who was on the ship with Jonah. The sailors were caught up in the chaos because of Jonah's disobedience. Here's a lesson for us. When we run from God, we often drag others into our storms, and our choices impact more than just us. And we bring chaos and confusion and stress to our relationships, to our families, to our friendships. All of that happens when we resist God's plans. The sailors try everything that they can to survive. They're throwing stuff overboard. And they're crying out to their gods, but nothing seemed to work. Nothing caused the storm to calm. It's interesting that clearly they knew this was a different kind of storm. There was something special, something unique, something supernatural, not like anything they had ever seen or experienced before. Eventually, they realized that Jonah, who's below deck, they realized that Jonah was the reason for the storm. He'd been sleeping in the middle of the storm, trying to ignore the mess that he had caused. But he couldn't hide for long. Finally, he owns up to it. Owning up means we take responsibility for our disobedience. They asked Jonah, tell us, who is responsible for making all this trouble for us? Jonah answers, I am a Hebrew. I worship the Lord, the God of heaven who made the sea and the dry land. So finally, when confronted, Jonah admits that the storm is his fault. Sometimes the hardest thing to do is to own up to our own disobedience. We want to shift the blame. We want to make more excuses or ignore the problem. But until we acknowledge that we've been running from God, the storms in our life won't calm down. Let me ask you, where in your life have you been running from God's plans? Where have you been rationalizing sin or disobedience? No guilt, no shame, no judgment. I've been there. We've all been there. But listen, the first step to peace is admitting that you've been avoiding God's call. Ultimately, it's about surrendering to God. Surrender occurs when we finally trust God's plans. So Jonah says to the crew, pick me up and throw me into the sea, he replied, and it will become calm. I know that this is my fault, that this great storm has come upon you. Finally, Jonah surrenders. He knows what's really going on. He knows the only way to calm the storm is to stop running and to let God take control. When we surrender to God's plans, we let go of our need to control and we trust that his way is better, even when it feels like it's wrecking our own plans. After Jonah is thrown overboard, the sea suddenly becomes calm and something incredible happens. The sailors who had been crying out to their false gods, now they turned to the one true God in worship. I want you to see this in verse 16. Then the men feared the Lord exceedingly, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord, and they made vows. I love this. Even in Jonah's stubbornness, even in Jonah's disobedience, even in Jonah's rebellion, God's grace is still at work and he's drawing others to himself. That's how amazing our God is. That's how great his grace is, that he works even when we fight against him and even when we run from him. God's grace is there even in the wreckage. Even though Jonah ran from God, the story doesn't end there. God's grace is bigger than Jonah's disobedience, and the storm, the ship, and the sea, they all served a greater purpose to bring Jonah back to God's plan. Here's the good news for us. Even when we resist God, even when we run from God, God doesn't give up on us. His grace just keeps coming after us. It just keeps pursuing us, just as it did with Jonah. Sometimes God's plans feel like they're wrecking our plans, but in reality, he's leading us into something different. Dare I say, something better. And it's scary, but we can always trust him because we know that he is in control of it all. And he has a plan and he's working it for good to those who are called according to his purpose. Jonah's story serves as a reminder that running from God's plans, it only leads to storms and to chaos and to going downward. We think We're avoiding discomfort, but in reality, we're running into disaster. But even in the wreckage, God's grace is there to pull us back. Where in your life are you resisting God's plans? What storm are you facing because you've been running? Today, God is calling you to stop running and to stop rationalizing and to surrender. His plans might wreck yours, but they will lead you to a place of purpose and peace in a deeper relationship with Him. So take a moment this week to reflect on the areas of your life where you've been running from God's plans. Pray and ask for the courage to surrender your plans to Him, trusting that His ways are always better, even when it feels uncomfortable.